Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our latest Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth webinar. This evening we had with us Shaun Bailey, who we actually had in person before a couple of years ago, a Caribbean rum tasting event that we had. So not quite the same this evening, but we have to make do in the circumstances. Without further ado, I'll pass over to my colleague Samuel Ennis, who will introduce Shaun, and then we'll kick off the discussion shortly after.
Thank you, Paul. It is my great privilege to do an introduction for Shaun Bailey. Shaun was born in North Kingston, graduating in computer-aided engineering from London South Bank University. In 2006, Shaun founded My Generation, a charity addressing social problems that affect struggling young people and their families. Shaun worked as a researcher for the Centre for Policy Studies and then became a special advisor to David Cameron on youth and crime, which is when I think I first heard about him. Shaun unsuccessfully stood as a parliamentary candidate in Hammersmith in 2010 and Lewisham Western Penge in 2017, but Shaun was elected to the London Assembly in 2016, and in 2018 you were selected as a Conservative candidate for the London Mayoral election. I've been impressed by your strong campaign and challenge of Sadiq Khan, and I wish you all the best in this May's election.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. I want to echo Sam and Paul's words. We're really excited to have you on our platform today. Today, we'll get a real understanding of who Shaun Bailey is and what are some of his core beliefs. And we can announce we will be doing another webinar with Shaun close to May on an election special, which will be solely focused on the forthcoming London mayoral election. Shaun, I want to start with, how have you been coping in the past year under these unprecedented times?
Firstly, let me say good evening to you all. As you all know, I am a descendant of Commonwealth on two levels, in that I'm British, we're in the Commonwealth, and of course my parents are Jamaican. So I'm always ecstatic about the Commonwealth. I think for the next 1500 years, the Commonwealth is where a lot of activity will lie on a global level. So I think the people on this call, the Commonwealth in general, we are in a position to really do something significant for mankind. So I think that's why I'm here today. But look, let me just quickly answer the question. How have I been coping? Just like everybody else, there's been ups and downs. Anybody on this call, for instance, who's a parent will tell you homeschooling is not the easiest thing to happen to them recently. That's been reasonably tough. Campaigning, of course, has looked very different. We're all very used to this Zoom, Teams, Google Hangouts, whatever it is. But of course, campaigning doesn't, in my opinion, need a face-to-face element. So in many ways, this has been a more efficient way of campaigning. I can speak to all of you now. You could be anywhere in the world, but there's a part of campaigning that needs people to see you face-to-face, which we've missed slightly. You build a better team when you can go around and see people as well, and that's been tough. But I've just been coping by just keep reaching out, keep learning what London needs, keep campaigning, keep putting it to Sadiq Khan as to why he's done such a poor job. I'll just keep going. It's my nature to keep going, and I'll continue to do that. I wish we could see each other face to face, but when that happens, it is anybody's guess.
It'd be great to do this again at some point face to face. I'm sure it won't be hopefully too far in the distant future. I want to start by getting a better understanding of what your upbringing was like. Samuel mentioned there, you were born in North Kensington, London. What was it like growing up there?
So I come from your classic, West Indian single parent family. I was raised by my mum primarily, but our extended family, so my grandmother, my great uncle, everybody like that. I come from Ladbroke Grove originally, so I was born there. I was born in Paddington Hospital, the old one, before they knocked it down. We moved to we lived in Ladbroke Grove, and I grew up in the 70s where everything socially was tougher than it probably is now. More poverty, more crime. It was a tough time. But of course, I came from a big, loving family, a very strong community. We had challenges in our community, but we also had a great deal of togetherness. And where I come from in Ladbroke Grove, there was a large Moroccan community after that. So I'm a card-carrying, church-attending Christian, but I also grew up in a very big Muslim community as well. Many of the boys I grew up with, and later when I went on to set up my charity, I would say anything up to 70% of our sort of users were from a Muslim background, which is great because it meant I had my faith, but I also knew that other people's faith was important to them. I grew up in what I call a Dulux paint pot environment, black, white, green, blue, mauve. In my very early years in primary school, the Vietnamese boat children came and joined our school. So for one day, all of a sudden, that's it. It's a whole other new race of children. And why I highlight that to you, because it gave me a London that was a melting pot where there's lots of people who are different to you and it didn't matter. And I say that because I think one of the failings of Sadiq Khan and the left in London has been to drive wedges between communities, make everybody feel like they're underprivileged instead of working on what brings us together. Because to my mind, we all largely have the same challenges. Yes, there's some differences. So for instance, if you're from any ethnic background, racism is probably a bigger deal to you than it is to a white community. But we have the same issues as well. Say, wanting to feed our children, wanting good employment in the future, safe, secure London. But my reckoning on that came from growing up in that community. Very little money, but largely safe. We could travel around in a way that young people wouldn't do these days. And again, I had great family support. My family were around me and helped me model my way through life.
You mentioned there and earlier about being of Jamaican descent. Is that something you hold deeply, and what kind of role has that played in your life?
I mean, if there's anybody on this call who's of Jamaican descent, they'll tell you have no choice. It runs deep. But my mum once said to me that Jamaicans abroad are even more Jamaican than Jamaicans at home. And I have a friend who's a Sikh who said a very similar thing to me about Indians. And you know the deal. If you are from an immigrant community in Britain, your roots, as you were, home, as your parents might call it, become very important. But I think one of the real points of how Britain works is that many of us, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, West Indian, whatever, we hold on to home, but Britain is also our home. I often say to people, part of my heart's Jamaican, my head's British. You grow up in that environment, and I see it as a plus because it means you learn and love two communities. And my parents are proud Jamaicans. I mean, what can I say? If you're Jamaican or West Indian on this call, the words ackee and saltfish will mean things for you, hard dough bread, all those kind of things. That's where I'm coming from. And very recently, I spoke to the Jamaican ambassador, which was just a really wonderful, wonderful conversation. And it reminded me that the power that the Commonwealth has in Britain is that link, is that diaspora link. If you're Indian and you're sat here, how do you feel about your British life, and how can you use your Indian connections, Indian understanding, Indian parents to help benefit both India and Britain? I think that's the same for anybody in this country who's from a foreign, who has roots from a foreign land. Yes, I'm a Londoner born and bred. My dad calls me English boy. That's what he calls me. But I have learned a lot of what for me is my moral compass from the fact that my parents are Jamaican.
You mentioned the Commonwealth there, and being Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth is something that we will definitely bring up a bit later on. I know you spent many years as a youth officer. What did you particularly enjoy about that role, and how did you become a youth officer?
So I did youth work for well over 20 years, probably about 26 in total. And I came to it for a few things. One was just fun. I lived in my community and it was great to meet people and do things. And a friend of mine, his dad was a youth worker and said, you should do it, Shaun, you'll be good at it, you'll enjoy it. So when I was very, very young, just about 16, I worked on a summer day program. It was in John Kelly's school, which is in Northwest London, Neasden. The guy running it needed some help. Some of the local kids were a bit unruly. My little sister said to him, Shaun knows these boys, they'll behave, get Shaun in. And that was the sort of start. And I had such a wonderful time. It was just a wonderful time. So I did youth work on and off. Then I went away to university and came back, and some kids I'd known had been murdered. Another kid I know had been involved in a murder. And I thought to myself, I know enough about this community to help. I know enough about the world and this community to form some kind of bridge and help. And that's when I really dove headlong into youth work and was trying to use it as an arena to help people improve themselves. And ultimately, I was very, very blessed. I was able to go on and start my own charity. And I focused on how do I make young people and our entire community take a forward step. And for me, that really, it really leaned heavily on my conservative values. It was about, being self-reliant, being self-propelled. It was about work. It was about family. It was about study. It was about all those things that our parents would want us to do. I found a hopefully cooler, out of your house way of bringing as many young people into that as I can. And I did lots of things. I ran anti-crime, I ran a girls group, a boys group. At one point we were having Bible studies because when I became a Christian, my Muslim brothers came over to me and said, look, let's do a Bible study. And I was like, I'm just not the guy to lead a Bible study. But I went and found them someone who could do that. And that was a really good convening point for our community. I remember much later on as an adult at this point, meeting a Sikh, one of the elders at Vedanta temple, and him speaking to me about faith, his faith, my faith, and the link all of these things have. One of the deepest conversations I've ever had. And I tell you that story because it links back to, I became a youth worker to bring people in. I got into politics to bring people in. And he pointed out to me that all of our religious traditions are about bringing people in. And I think that's a metaphor and a message for London. We need to make sure that we're inclusive and that we don't allow communities to be victimized or become victims in their own head. And that's why I'm very big on how do you open up. And going through youth work, I dealt with children and families in very, very, very hard positions. And the resolving of those positions was almost always seeking outside help. So outside help within their family, maybe within a wider community. But we do need to come together to make those things happen. And like I say, for me, youth work was a pleasure, a job, self-growth. It was great. And I always try to hold on to those years to inform the political decisions I make now.
It's great to hear about your role as a youth officer. And what I think a number of people will find fascinating on this call is, how did your journey begin in politics? What you mentioned it briefly there. How did you then have these sort of more political ambitions? And also following up on something that you touched on there, there's a lot of things that when you look at yourself and even probably myself in terms of when don't really stand out as your typical conservatives in terms of what we often see and are portrayed as. What kind of things drew you towards the Conservative Party?
I'm going to stop you right there for 1 second. We are typical conservatives. If you look at the tradition of our parents, right? I don't know where your parents are from, but if you look at the traditions of our parents, you'll find they're very, very conservative. What's interesting about Britain in the context of people of an ethnic background, almost any ethnic background, our homeland, our parents are far more conservative than the Conservative Party is. Conservatism is the foundation on which we build our lives. So I'd argue we are typical conservatives. The Labour Party wants people not to think of themselves as conservative, so peddle that message. Certainly socially conservative, and that's where your politics comes from, your social experiences, I would argue. That's the first thing. The second thing for me, I got involved in politics as a result of my youth work. So I'm very big on telling people, do not let people call you disadvantaged for their own good. If you're disadvantaged, there may well be truth in that, but you have to view yourself as being able to move beyond that. Often people call you disadvantaged because it suits them. You have to ask yourself, does it suit you? And I'm always telling children, black, white, gay, straight, old, whatever, you must be part of your future. Take a step out, seek. I always used to talk about, if you see an opportunity, grab it with both hands. So many moons ago, I was invited to something to speak as a youth worker, and I thought the people were just telling war stories. They were just making poor people feel like they had absolutely nothing. So I was quite annoyed, and I said as much in a room, and I was let's just say I wasn't that polite. There was a man there called Lord Nash who thought it was absolutely hilarious. He liked the fact that I got to the point. Steve Hilton heard and asked David Cameron to come and see me talk. So David Cameron came along to a different event, saw me talk. He then came over to me and said, "You're exactly what we're looking for Conservative candidates." Now, you can imagine, I want you to understand the scope of that day. So in the morning, I'd had a fight in the car park with a drug dealer. And then in the evening, David Cameron invited me to become a Tory MP. Now, you can see how these two things may not be related. And I said to David Cameron, at the time, I thought it was hilarious. Looking back, it was a bit much. I said to David Cameron, "Don't call us, we'll call you." You know. And then I went back to my youth group and I bumped into two parents who were always trying to get me to think of youth work in the broadest sense. So I then said I told them what happened. And one of them, this woman, she was absolutely furious. And I said, "What's wrong with you?" And she said, "You're constantly preaching at the children about doing more, stepping outside of their community, doing that, being a surprise." So for instance, in the case of her own daughter, I was saying to her, she's interested in medical science. I said, "You should be a GP. Why can't you be a GP?" Because everybody in school told her she couldn't succeed. I was like, "Why cannot you not be a GP?" And her mother basically replayed that conversation to me. So I thought, you know what? She's completely right. I'm going to go back. I'm going to get involved. And I'm just going to demonstrate to everyone, you can do this, you know. And I went back to Lord Nash and the Centre for Policy Studies and said, "Would you help me do this?" And they leapt into action. And they fast forward a year or whatever it was, I was selected. And I must admit, I didn't think I was going to be selected for Hammersmith. I was. The very next day, I went to meet the association and I could see straight away they were very serious about this. So I got serious very quickly. I did all the work, and it hangs on one of my other things I always say to young people as well. Turn up, back yourself. You cannot start a revolution from your bed. The harder you work, the luckier you get. So I was trying to live what I was preaching. And I, you know, nobody expected me to win, and I get it, but I ran the noisiest, hopefully most relevant campaign I could. And I didn't win. And the very next day I went back to work. I just, you know, I didn't win, fine, I get it. I went back to work. But then about 3 months after that, maybe 4, yeah, David Cameron's office rang me and said, "Look, the Prime Minister wants to speak to you." And he said to me, "Shaun, would you consider being a special advisor?" And again, in order to look cool, I said, "Let me think about it, and then I'll get back to you." I rang my mum and I was like, "Mum, pack your bags, we're off to number 10, like, job done." But for me, it was a culmination of the support I'd received from the community. They were all saying, "Come on, Shaun, do stuff." So I did stuff. And there was a little part of me that really enjoyed making my mum proud. That moment when my mum said to me, "So what, you're going to have an office in 10 Downing Street?" I was like, was yes. And of course, the intellectual, rational me was thinking, my youth work was very good and powerful in my community. But if I can do anything in politics, I can have that effect, but on a much larger scale. So I then focused on politics and trying to make it work. But my entry into politics was not your conventional route. I spent a lot of times, if you're on this call now and you want to be in politics, I'd say 2 things to you. Know your subject, know what you're interested in. So I spent a lot of time being involved with think tanks, agreeing, disagreeing, having the debates, learning stuff, reading the books, and also have a little bit of a life before politics. If you take a look into politics, the most shouty, useless people are the ones who've had no life beforehand. Just have a little bit of life experience, or a lot, it's up to you, but you've got to have something to offer people. And I think life experience allied to good technical understanding is the way forward.
Something you mentioned there, and it brings on the next question perfectly. And you mentioned there about sort of typical Conservatives, and I'll give you an example. You know, I'm Indian descent. Both my parents were born in India, and my dad was actually a Conservative councillor. And so, you know, one of the things I think most people will agree with you is that, you know, we do hold generally quite conservative values, and you know, it's I don't think a few people disagree, but sometimes the stigma can be the difficult part. And this leads on to my next question about shy Conservatives. If you look on social media, that the stats for the last election, you know, they heavily tend to be in favour of Labour, and you know, the actual result was obviously very, very different. How do we go about changing this? You know, someone's message in about this also. You know, as yourself and many others are fantastic examples of what the party is, but still many seem afraid to voice their opinion, especially in this new age of council culture. How do you go about sort of changing that aspect?
You are 100% correct. And I wish I had something I'm very clever to say, but I don't, other than step out, be brave. You know, there's some people on this call now who are a genius. There's other people on this call, their calling in life, their vocation is to be brave. You know, bravery isn't the lack of fear. It's action in the presence of fear. Be clear. I've had many times I've had to say or do things and people have told me that's wrong, you can't do that. I've had people tell me I can't be conservative because I'm black. I remember speaking in school and a young kid saying to me, don't I feel like I've let down all the black people by joining the Conservative Party? And my response to him was, don't you feel like you've let down all the black people in the world by being limited in your thinking? Somebody, probably a white person, has decided that you cannot be a conservative and told you that and you've believed it. But for me, there's three big things here. One, the shyness will only be overcome when we build a big enough, loud enough, diverse enough group of people to invite people into. Two, if we allow people to control the thinking of our communities, they will lose. There's a very strong and loud and continuous conversation in the black community of how we're always overlooked, and that's because our vote is taken for granted. And there's many other BME communities who need to be careful they don't slip into that. The left absolutely take us for granted. And three, particularly if you're young, so if you're below the age of 40, right, which is probably everybody on this call, I don't know, join the Rebel Alliance. We are the Rebel Alliance. If you step out publicly and tell people that you're conservative, you are the Rebel Alliance. I did a tour of universities and spoke at a lot of different universities. And at the end of it, that's the conclusion I got to. All of the young people in conservative associations in university had basically had to make a decision to be bold. And that says two things. One, it's necessary for the health of the country. And two, left-wing politics is full of bullies. You know, they bully you either with them or against them. Why we have always delivered better for this country and many countries across the world is because we don't view everybody else as the enemy. We view politics as the art of the possible and for challenges to be solved. And I'll sum it up to you like this. About 5 years ago now, I was at conference and I got speaking to a BBC cameraman in the bar. And he said he's going to be voting Conservative for the first time. I said, wow, that's great. Why is that? He said, because I've done all 3 conferences this year. And he said, when I was at the Labour Party conference, he said, when at the Conservative Party conference, you're talking about politics. At the Labour Party conference, they're talking about you. And he said, I can't see how they solve all the big problems in the world if all they're focused on is the fact that they hate you. And a lot of their arguments are based on fire and brimstone, not reason and stats. And that's why they win on an emotional level, but they're very poor when it comes to leadership. Sadiq Khan is a perfect example of that. He made 20 election pledges and has broken 19 of them. And the reason he's broken 19 of them is because he doesn't have to care if he's telling the truth, because he's constantly rubbing people's emotions and not helping them move forward. He's helping himself move forward. And for me, that's why not only should we be conservatives, but we must be conservatives.
You've made a great point there, and so I'd love to touch on more. Is almost this emergence of not just the left, the far left, it seems, in the Labour Party, that just seems to be growing and growing. And you mentioned about how Labour almost always had this emotional element, whereas we tend to be the party of almost reason. How do we combat that going forward? You know, coming up with, I don't want to touch too much on the election because I know we've got another webinar on this. But how do we start to emerge, if you like, with the emotion and reason? Because their argument tends to be very emotion-led. How are you planning, and how can we plan to almost make that difference?
So I'd say a number of things. I'd say, firstly, do not underestimate the Labour Party. They are brilliant politicians. And also, as well, accept that the left are not wrong about everything and we are not right about everything. That's the start point. The other piece is to make emotional arguments. It is the most compelling people through history have linked emotion and fact. And we have the facts, which I often would suggest are harder to get hold of because emotion is our natural state. We are emotional beings. So I'd say the argument is to link emotion and facts, and be very clear. And don't be ashamed of the fact that we believe in capitalism. So, for instance, I had a student tell me off at length about capitalism, and all I did was reply by saying, let's be clear, capitalism has raised more people out of poverty than socialism, communism, and any other ism you combined. They are the facts. They are the facts. And if I'm wrong, why has the biggest socialist nation in the world decided it's going to be a capitalist nation? There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. Look, we will have to make arguments in the way that people will listen to, but also we should be prepared to get down and fight. What the left do, they make strong, consistent, personal attacks. We have to rebut those attacks and go back at them, because the thing I've learned, they absolutely don't like when you replay their tactics on them. They absolutely don't like that. And we should show them that if they want to have a civil conversation, we're prepared to do that. And if they want to have a fight, we're prepared to do that as well. I think it's a matter of respect, and it's a matter of effectiveness.
Talking of sort of left movements and just general movements, you know, massive part of 2020 was the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, one thing I think many would probably agree on this phone call with some of your comments that you mentioned about it being a sort of political propaganda. And we've had a number of politicians who have pretty much echoed your comments, especially when, you know, on the website you can see about defunding police and the lack of focus on nuclear families. And how those views, obviously you came out public, has that changed much for you on your thoughts on the movement? And do you think is there something else that we should be doing better rather than, let's just say, following the Black Lives Matter organization?
The struggles of Black peoples across the world for equality is, for me, obviously I have a vested interest, is one of the most noble goals this planet has yet set for itself. Black Lives Matter hijacked that. Now, if Black Lives Matter said to us, that's the goal, let's go for it, let's have a conversation. But my problem was, you had an organization that was saying, let's smash up capitalism, let's defund the police, and let's get rid of the nuclear family. Now, there's absolutely no way Black populations across the world would support that. I don't think they support any one of them, forget all three of them. And that was where my problem lay. And I was saying to people, do you understand that people, the left have hijacked our deepest desire for their own political benefit? And that, for me, is a real demonstration of who the left really are. They have a thing at their core that says by any means necessary. That's what they mean. They believe that the ends justifies the means. And that, for me, is a worry. And Black Lives Matter was a real demonstration of that. And what I saw with that is it came in a big flash. Everybody supported it from an emotional point of view. But as time went on and the onion was peeled and people sat back and thought, hold on a second, you saw it was something very different. They then tried to change tack, and I don't think they could, because their backers and what they wanted to achieve had already been captured. Because all of the people I know who are strong Black activists started in one place with it and have now moved to another position. And I think that will continue to happen. And my worry was that undermined the whole process for Black people at seeking this justice. That was my worry, because of course, if you're outside of this, you'll take Black Lives Matters as our view, as a view of Black people, and many other groups of people have big problems with that. And now Black people have another thing to explain. You know, anti-racism is, to my mind, natural justice. It's simple. Black Lives Matter made it a lot more complicated to have the conversation.
I think there's not many people that would disagree on this call with you there. I think the political agenda was so clear in some of the more socialistic Marxist views. And one thing that, you know, that's mentioned a lot on our platform, and another topic that we regularly mention is China and the CCP. You've been very vocal about your thoughts on them. How do you feel about China currently and some of the practices that the CCP have put in place, especially we're seeing more and more accusations of modern day slavery?
I think you've made an important point there. I want to make a separation there. This isn't China or the Chinese people. This is a Chinese Communist Party. It's very important that distinction is made. It's a very different group of people, for want of another. So it's a very ingrained ruling class. I think some of the things they've been doing are, well, they're abominable, aren't they? They're abominable. If you look at how they've treated the Uyghur Muslims, if you look at how they've treated Christians along the way, how they've treated democracy along the way. And the reason I've been so strong against it is because London has a global footprint. And I think there's an opportunity and an obligation to say things. So I was very big on de-twinning from Beijing as our sister city. London is twinned with Beijing. I said, let's de-twin, because I want to send a message. You can't expect our respect and all of the things that come from that if you're going to behave in this way. We wouldn't do that to anybody. Forget our own, as it were. And I wanted to send that message. And I was quite surprised when on the London Assembly, the Labour group played silly buggers with it. And then Sadiq Khan came out and said he has no problem with the Chinese Communist Party. I think what they showed with that is that their political belief is more important than our human rights. And I was slightly shocked at that, because myself and people who have no sort of political agreement could see that there was a basic injustice there, and we wanted to do something about it. So that's why I've done it. And of course, in a world that's as unstable as it is now, there's lots of competing interests and there's lots of groupthink going on. To reach out to people with one of our most tried and tested philosophies, and by that I mean democracy, I think is important. You know, China, the Chinese people, Hong Kong, a significantly different history and group of people from Britain, but we share, well, at least Hong Kong and Britain share democracy. And I personally think, as Churchill said, democracy is the least worst way to run a country. And I think we should always be promoting the benefits of democracy and making sure that people have basic human rights across the world.
Talking of China, and we're entering the post-Brexit age, and we are looking obviously to create new partners across the Commonwealth, across the globe. And being the Conservative Friends of Commonwealth platform, we're obviously going to be mention the Commonwealth. And how do you think the Commonwealth and the role of the Commonwealth will play out in the next few years? There's many arguments, not only the post-Brexit argument, but also diversifying away from China. How do you view the Commonwealth going forward?
The Commonwealth is an opportunity and a challenge for everyone. So if you're from the Commonwealth, we all have our different relationship with the Commonwealth and with Britain. And for many of us, it'll be making sure that our nation comes as a partner, not in a subservient way. For many of us, it'll be purely about business. For others, it'll be about culture. The Commonwealth will be as important and as big as we, as British people who have a strong Commonwealth link for our parents, etc., can make it. And also the Commonwealth can make it. It won't happen magically. It will happen through hard work. And that's why organizations like yours, young people like you, who are thinking about how do we flex that relationship, is important. I think that's the baseline. I would also say we're off to a flying start. If you look at the links between Britain and Canada, Pakistan, India, the West Indies, some of these links are as enormous as is possible to be. Some have the potential to be. And I think now that we're out of the EU, we'll hopefully have a much more holistic global view of the world and not be driven entirely by what our closest partners want. Make no mistake, the European Union will always be important to Britain, but now we have the space to make other places important to Britain as well. And I say to anybody on this call, remember, if you're British, and I mean British in the white English sense, you're from the Commonwealth. And it's up to you to get involved. It's up to you to reach out to everybody across the world, across the Commonwealth, and make this work, because it's beneficial for both parties. And of course, if you're from anywhere else in the Commonwealth, I issue the same challenge. The Commonwealth is there's huge potential in the Commonwealth, but like all potential, it has to be realized. The obvious places to start are business, but there's other things around environmental protection, environmental development that we could also partner on as well.
Of course, I've mentioned this already, but we will do a proper session on the election coming up. But I thought we'd cover a little bit whilst we have you here. I'll start with, why do you want to be the next mayor of London?
I mean, there's lots of different reasons. Part of it, the big personal part, is a continuation of showing the people from my community. And let me be clear about my community. Anybody who comes from a poor, struggling community, anybody who comes from a community where we need to work for a living and 1 month missed 1 week or 1 month missed in salary or wages would be devastating. Anybody in those circumstances. I'm just trying to demonstrate we deserve a place at the table too, if we put in the time, if we put in the work, if we take the responsibility. That's the big thing. That's why I'm in politics. That's what's led me to this point. The other piece is slightly professional. I've been on the London Assembly for over 4 years now, and I just think London can do better. Sadiq Khan has been terrible. It's a fact. Ken Livingstone, Boris Johnson were significantly better mayors than this man. And instead of doubling down on the job, instead of seeking help, what he's done is played politics, blamed it on everybody else, and never taken responsibility for anything once any day at all. And I just think London can do better. And I've sat in the chamber with Sadiq Khan and listened to him lie one time too many. So I said, I'm going to put my head above the parapet just to offer Londoners an alternative. And if I take you all the way back to my stories as to why I got involved in politics, I didn't think I was going to be selected. I just wanted to show people, there's people from my walk of life who want to have a voice at the table. And if we're given the chance, we would grab it with both hands. Here I am. And I think that came through. And I say to anybody listening, even if you spent your whole life voting Labour, do you honestly believe in your heart to heart that Sadiq Khan is the right man for the job? He's had 5 years to deliver for London and hasn't delivered anything. 19 election pledges he broke out of 20. And the only reason I make all these political statements is this: London needs a fresh start. We've got to go forward. We have an opportunity here to make sure London's best days are ahead of it, not behind it. Hong Kong, New York, all having big problems. We need to step up for our own good and for the good of the world. I am that fresh start that London needs. My vision for London as a global powerhouse in the arts, in business, in culture, in bringing people together is what the world needs, is what London needs. And that's why I stood for London. And I also wanted to demonstrate to people that conservatism, particularly in London, is modernizing at a pace that people wouldn't believe. My proudest boast was I was selected by the members, and they had a very broad choice of people who to select, and they selected me. And I asked a member who voted for me in Putney, why did you vote for me? And to my great, great, great pleasure, she never once said, because you're black. She never, ever. I said to her, did you vote for me because you're black? And she looked at me and she's like, in fact, I hadn't even considered that. And that for me says everything, because what it says is people from our communities, Indian, Pakistani, Bengali, I don't know, anywhere, all the communities we have represented in London, we are Londoners first, and we have so much to offer this city and this country, and it's been recognised by everybody else. And I just wanted to take my chance to do my little bit to help London have that fresh start.
In follow-up to that, what will be the sort of key areas that you will be focusing on for the next election, and should you be elected?
So somebody said to me, what will you do in your first 100 days? And my response to them was crime, 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 crime. We've got to push crime down in London. Too many people have a horrific story of being a victim of crime. And the reason I want to push crime down as well is because it's the poorest people who suffer the most from crime. So let's make sure our most vulnerable people are safe. That's number one. Number two is the environment, and I mean in the broadest sense. London has lots of greenery that's not used properly. Our air could do with a little bit more cleaning, and we could do with a more pleasant built environment. I want to do that. And thirdly, I would say housing. Housing has been London's chronic problem for a long time, and I want to come at it from a slightly different angle. I want to do 100,000 homes for £100,000, and how I intend to do that is to use shared ownership, because what it means is whatever happens, shared ownership is cheaper than renting, and it gives young people like the people I'm staring at now, first-time buyers, a much easier step onto the housing ladder. So for instance, the average deposit in London now is £109,000. That takes 23 years to save. With my shared ownership scheme, the average deposit will be £5,000, and you can buy a portion of your property and you can staircase at 1% at a time. And the reason I want to do that is twofold. One, real conservatism should always try to give people capital. Capital makes capitalism much more equal. And I want a fairer, safer, more equal city. So I want to give as many people as possible access to that capital. And two, what is the greatest asset, the most expensive asset that London has? London itself, the land. So what I want to do is flex that land. So I'm building a system now that means not only will I be able to provide those homes, I will get an uplift straight back into London's coffers so we can spend that money on helping people who are homeless, helping people who have alcohol problems, drug problems. I want to build a London sovereign wealth fund, for want of a better term, that London can decide whatever it wants to spend on, because social uplift is the indication of a civil society. And if Britain has anything on its side, it's our strong civil organizations. And I'm staring now at a group of people who are members of a very strong civil organization that has a real meaningful conversation to have with and on behalf of London and indeed the Commonwealth. So that's why I want to use what we have: housing, policing, the environment, not only to deliver services for London, but to deliver uplift for London as well.
It's worth noting, obviously, we understand that London isn't just a young population, but we have had a number of questions come in regarding young people in London. I'm going to start with Steed Bennett and Barnaby, who are both saying similar sort of questions. And Steve Barnaby is, hi Shaun, how do we as Conservatives show young people in London having conservative views is nothing to be ashamed of when they do speak up, and how do we ensure they're not drowned out? And then Barnaby's followed up with something similar, saying, how can we appeal to more young voters in London?
Challenge their views. So I spoke at LSC, some very young, sharp people, and I asked them, well, why do you vote Labour? Demonstrate to me why you vote Labour. And they had all these stories, and I said, okay, and I demonstrated to them why A, the story wasn't true, or there's equivalent Conservative story. So a lot of people talk to me about racism in the Conservative Party, and I say things to them like, the Conservative Party have never lost a seat to the BNP, the Labour Party have. So the Labour voters have just gone and voted BNP when Labour haven't given them what they want. The unions have a strong, long history of racism. If you're an Indian, for instance, you will know about when the Indian car workers went on strike, the unions didn't support them right up until the point they thought the Indians were going to win. Then all of a sudden, they're the best friends they ever had. Let's talk about the fact that in the Second World War, the unions didn't want to load the ships to fight a fascist who, by the way, had no time for anybody of color. These are the things. The other thing I told them, so they'll tell me about Rivers of Blood and Enoch Powell. And I told them, he made that speech, and what happened? He was sacked. What happened to the 11 Labour MPs who wrote to the then Prime Minister and asked for no more black people to be allowed in the country? Absolutely nothing. Some of them went on to become ministers. So the point is, the idea that the Labour Party is this lovely, warm, cuddly organisation that has the best interests of poor people at heart, it simply isn't true. I can go on. Let's talk about what they did for women. They ran a long campaign for men to be paid more, so women had to stay at home. So a family could afford to keep its women at home. You ask any woman now how she feels about that, and I'm pretty sure you get quite a sharp answer. The point I'm trying to make is the idea that the Labour Party have some clean, shiny history when it comes to relationships between themselves and ethnic communities isn't true. Let me be clear, neither is it true for the Conservative Party. Simply isn't. But the point is, we've had to own up to it, and they've continually made us own to it. Let's make them own up to theirs. The other thing as well, challenge them with the facts. Challenge them with the facts. If you really want to change the plight of poor people, if you really want to help disabled people, if you really want the NHS to survive, challenge them with the facts. Let's be clear. The biggest monies the NHS have ever had has come from the Conservative Party. In fact, the Conservative Party were just as instrumental in starting the NHS as Labour were. The single biggest uplift in cash given by Theresa May, our second female Prime Minister, again came from the Conservative Party. The point I'm trying to make here, they have got as far as they've got on myth and bluster and warm words with no change. We are a party that's trying to build capacity in other people's communities. We're not a party trying to hoard all the power into our unions. And remember, yes, anybody could join a union, but unions work for their members. They don't work for the public. And the public is a far bigger union of people, if you see what I mean. I'll give you a case in point. One of the best paid jobs in manual work in London is to be a tube driver. The unions have made sure that no tube job, no train driving job, no tube job has been advertised since 2009. All of the jobs go to their mates in their unions. There's something wrong there. So don't let people talk to you as if the Conservative Party are up to something, because we're not. What we're trying to do is make the individual strong, because families are based on the individual. That's what we're after.
It's a great point you made about the two female prime ministers, both only under Conservative governments. And it's worth noting, we do have the most diverse cabinet in history in the UK, and that is a concern. And maybe we probably don't shout about it or advertise it well enough, but they're very valid points. We've had another question come in from Roger, who seems like he's based in London, and he's talking about how can the Conservatives attract keen members in local regional groups. He's making the argument that it's a bit more difficult in comparison to the Labour Party in joining these constituencies in sort of inner London, as opposed to Conservative in ward meetings.
Roger, I would say this: we do have associations in every borough. Some boroughs have 2 or 3 because of our systems. So technically, it's easy. I can't say if it's easier to join with the Labour Party. I've never tried, but it is technically quite easy. But let's be clear, Roger. It can be sometimes it can be hard, especially in inner London, because the associations are quite small for umpteen different reasons. But if you want to join and you feel like it isn't happening, there's 2 ways to go. Look to the associations around you, not just the one you're in. And what I mean is, for instance, imagine you live in Hackney and there isn't much activity. You can join the next one to your left or your right that's has more activity in it. Also, you can join centrally. Joining centrally is a way to be involved. And remember as well, we have a number of forums that you could join. So the Conservative Policy Forum, you could do that. You can join some of the more conservative thinking think tanks, like I'm a member of the Centre for Policy Studies, for instance. You could do those ways to flex your conservative bones. But I have been running my campaign for a very long time now in London. And one of my things has been to build up associations. I would say they would chomp your arm off if you wanted to become a member and get involved.
We've had a number of questions about the forthcoming election, and we will answer these questions, and we will ask these questions most likely in our next election webinar that we have. This is more sort of getting to know Shaun Bailey in terms of his personality, in terms of his core beliefs. So I'm going to end with a question from Mark, who's asking, do you think social media should be regulated in order to protect free speech?
I'm going to say no. It's a bit of a clumsy answer I'm going to give. I'm going to say no, because the minute you regulate, free speech goes out the window. Who's going to pick? Because if I'm regulating it and you say something that's about, the free market or whatever, I'll let it slide by. If you're going to start saying stuff about, we should nationalize, I'm going to outlaw that. Do you see what I mean? Social media is an absolute Wild West. Believe you me, I have been slaughtered on social media a number of times, but that's the price of democracy. As Churchill said, it's the least worst way of running a country. It isn't tidy. It is very messy democracy. And social media is an example of that. Why I said this is a messy answer, because I do believe we need to do something a bit more about fake news. I do believe we need to have a look at that. I'm very worried, for instance, about deep fakes. And if you take this Corona time, the amount of false information flying around in BAME communities on our WhatsApp groups about the vaccine, about Corona in general, is unbelievable. I never forget when the pandemic first broke out, I was reading things saying that Black people are immune. And of course, what that did was led to more deaths in the Black community. So while social media is a good thing, it can be a bad thing as well. I don't think we should regulate it though, because if you give human beings the ability to regulate, there'll be some bias. I think this open system we have is closer to free speech.
I'm going to end with, I follow you on Twitter, and I saw your call for people to get vaccinated, and going through, your Twitter, you get some absolutely horrible responses, some, really unfair and not nice things. What would be your advice for other people on this phone call who aspiring politicians or aspiring political members in dealing with that almost constant abuse on social media platforms?
So firstly, let me talk about the group. Stick together. Why Twitter has become horrible is because individuals can attack another individual. The left are particularly good at it. you know, London Labour, they arrange attacks me all the time, all that kind of stuff. I remember in my Twitter, I found a bot, which, you know, somebody put it in there. So I would say stick together. So for instance, if you're a Conservative friend of the Commonwealth, if your official account or one of the members you know tweets something out that you agree with and people jump on them, fight back. The nature of social media is people pile in a cowardly fashion. When a fight's been had, a fewer people pile in. And look, you don't need to get involved in a fight. Just show the person who's been brave enough to stick their head above the parapet. There are people out there who support them. That staying together is super, super, super important. Secondly, you might just have to accept the world is full of angry, misogynistic, racist, and any other ism you want to add to that people. And the plight of public figures is that you have to deal with it. I mean, I wish I didn't. I've tried to make sure there's a gap between myself and my family, for instance. So abusing me is one thing. Abusing my family would feel significantly different. So I try to operate in that way. And the third thing I'll say is, if you reach out to people, if you're out on social media, don't pay attention to people who are abusing you. That's what they want. They win when you crumble. You know, block them. Speak to like-minded people. I've had some good exchanges on Twitter with people who I met a guy. Actually, this was a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, on the doorstep, who's a committed socialist. We had a very, very, very serious conversation. Not 1 ounce of abuse. Not 1 ounce of abuse. And I said to him, you shouldn't vote for me. He said, why? I said, because you understand why you don't want to. I respect your view. I don't agree, but I respect your view. Do you know what he said to me? He will vote for me because I am able to have a political discussion, and I accept, and I say this to anyone, I'm not right about everything. Nobody is. And he said, at least there's an opportunity to change your mind. And I said, there'll always be that opportunity. But it was interesting that we were able to have that exchange. And you must be part of the change you want to see. Be able to talk to people without abusing them. If you start abusing them, then they were right to start abusing you. Don't do it. Have the conversation. And when it gets abusive and you can't have enough, stop. Don't waste your time, your energy on them. Move on. There's some people's minds you can change, and other people's minds, you're wasting your time.
On that note, thank you for your time today, Shaun. You know, everyone here at Conservative Friends of Commonwealth wants to wish you the best of luck in the forthcoming elections. And, you know, we want to help and try as much as we can to get you to win come May time. And hopefully we can be out campaigning with you soon, and we're able to help turn London back to being blue. But thank you again for your time.
I'll say two things. Firstly, I can see lots of people ask me questions about the campaign. I am eager to tell you, but I know I have to respect my host's wishes. I will be back, as my host has said, I will be back, and boy, can we have a talk about the campaign then. But look, my vision for London is a fairer, safer, more equal London, a London that is outward looking in its vision, a London that is a place where hustlers can come and build something, a London that is international and welcoming. That's the London I want to build. And in order to do that, we need to make London safer, so that no matter where you are in London, you feel safe. We need to give people the chance to live and own in London, so that you can have a stake in our society. And you need a mayor who will bring people together, and that's the kind of mayor I will be. The other thing I'd say, if you want to campaign for me right now, Connect Calling. Please, please, please contact the party and find out when we do Connect Calling. We do every Wednesday. You can do it from the comfort of your own sofa, and right here, right now, in lockdown times, is the most effective way to campaign. So we'd love to have you join us on Connect Calling. If you need further details, maybe I can circulate them to Conservative friends of the Commonwealth, and then they can pass those details out.
Definitely. I mean, we'll definitely do a Connect Calling session with Conservative Friends of Commonwealth as well, being involved, getting our members and our team all involved. We
do every Wednesday. We do every Wednesday now. You can just join that session and make the numbers bigger.
Great. We'll definitely do that. We'll circulate out to our members. So hopefully we can get as many people as possible involved. But again, thank you for your time, Shaun, and we will speak again, hopefully soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Peace.
Thank you.